crossing the border into neighboring Ukraine.
It was the West's spin on Russia's military drills which turned their speculations of an invasion into an alternate reality that only they and their supporters believed in.
As for the use of military force, there's no need for that at the moment. And the military drills that took place recently have nothing to do with the situation in Ukraine. We have this option, but it's an extreme measure.
Neo-nationalists in Ukraine were empowered after Viktor Yanukovych succumbed to their demands. Many of these neo-nationalists are criminals and former prisoners who are now looking to push their own agendas. Far-right activists like Igor Moisychuk, who only got out of prison this January and is also a suspect in a terrorist case. And there's Alexander Muzichko, who's made a number of anti-Semitic statements, intimidated authorities with weapons, and who is also facing prison time. And this is something no one and no country can afford to ignore.
Ukraine is in chaos right now, and it's not the first time our Western partners are messing with this country. Sometimes I get the feeling that across the ocean in America, there are scientists sitting in a lab experimenting with people as if they were guinea pigs.
While the Western world is preoccupied with making Russia look like the bad guy, extremism is on rise in Ukraine. And perhaps the focus right now should shift to those who are strings in the country and whether or not they will listen to what anyone has to say in the future. Marina Kosova, RT.
Okay, right. Comments from the U.S. President Obama on the ground indicate Russia's not up and aspirations of Ukraine's interim leaders.
We condemn the Russian Federation's act of aggression. The Russian government, out of excuses, hiding its hand behind falsehoods, intimidation, and provocations.
Earlier, John Kerry also accused Moscow of an invasion on a trumped-up pretext. Well, these are the countries which have been subject to America's bombings and interventions over the decades. Critics have accused Kerry of hypocrisy, referring to the victims of the U.S.-led war on invasions of a number of countries. Now, journalist Manuel Ochsenreiter also had some strong words for the U.S. Secretary of State. Take a listen.
It's really not worth to talk about the content of Kerry's speech, because maybe Kerry is one of the best paid professional liars in the West as State Secretary of the US. We have to remember what he was telling about Syria in the past, that he was one of the loudest warmongers now he does this function too when it goes against Russia. The worst thing is not talking about the content of his words, but to see that this is the part of a giant media propaganda war against Russia, particularly against Crimea and against the Russians in Ukraine. So this is really dramatic. And what Kerry does and says, so he's somehow like the pop star of this propaganda show against Russia, and this we should take serious.
Despite Russia not deploying any additional troops in Crimea, many major outlets, media outlets, are sounding the alarm over a full-blown military intervention. Now, with headlines claiming that thousands of Russian troops are flooding into Crimean Peninsula, or saying Russia has taken over the region. Some have even quoted an exact figure of 16,000 military personnel invading the country. Now, all of this could be frightening, except there's a very important nuance. The troops have been there for a long time and are part of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. In fact, they've been there for more than 200 years. Ukraine and Russia have a deal under which 25,000 Russian troops can legally be in Crimea. Currently, just over half that number are deployed. Ukraine also allows Russia the use of its airspace and waters, as well as over 100 various military installations. And as for Kiev, it too benefits tremendously from the agreement. Up until 2042, Russia will pay Ukraine almost $100 million in rent for the use of the base. And on top of that, Kiev gets a hefty discount for Russian gas. But it looks like the media has not even bothered to scratch the surface of the story. My colleague Marina Joshi discussed one of the more alarming examples of this with international affairs expert Mark Sleboda.
This picture comes from CNN's report, and they're claiming that these are Russian tanks. They're in Ukraine, despite the official denials of this report. How can you comment on this one?
Okay, well, of course, these tanks that we see there are not in Sevastopol in the Ukraine. Where they actually are taking place is in Russian military exercises inside of Russia. Thousands and thousands of miles away from where the CNN report claims to be. Now, this type of thing is not unusual. We've seen it across the media in the last few years, particularly, again, with regards to Russia. But the fact that it is CNN is particularly disturbing.
The contradiction between facts on the ground and Western media headlines is due to journalists using a very limited and specific range of sources, as politician scientist Mateusz Piskorski explains.
Most of the correspondents of the Western media are based in Kiev, and most of them take their information, or have the sole source of their information are the Ukrainian media, which of course are engaged in a kind of information war. This is the first point. Second, of course, any kind of sensational information, like an information about Russian troops coming to enter Crimea or to enter Ukrainian territory, are quite attractive for those who watch the media, for those who read the media. So this is a kind of commercial incentive to be to attract more and more attention.
After months of unrest, Ukraine is on the verge of defaulting on its debts. To cover this, the country's self-proclaimed authorities are ready to go to great lengths to get a loan from the International Monetary Fund. Now, they say they will carry out all reforms demanded by the international lenders. But they could prove very unpopular, as they're likely to see social programs and government spending cuts increase. Now, the measures also include a 40% increase on gas tariffs for households. Now, Ukraine hopes to get $15 billion in aid, but it needs twice as much by the end of the next year to keep the economy going, while the country's foreign debt stands at $140 billion. Patrick Young, who's an expert in global financial markets, says it's ordinary Ukrainians who will suffer if Kiev meets the IMF's demands.
The IMF have a very standard kind of prescription template, and that means that the government has to behave in a very fiscally sound fashion. Fiscally sound often does not mean terribly sympathetic towards the average everyday pensioners or citizens of the Ukraine, and that's exactly the situation we have here. Ukrainians are used to receiving their gas from Russia and then the government giving them an absolutely enormous subsidy on top. That will have to go under the IMF plans. They're going to have to bring in austerity, and it's certainly not going to appeal to ordinary people who are going to see their real standard of living collapse. That's why Mr. Yanukovych walked away from it some years ago.
Well, those who have risen to power on the back of the months-long uprising seem to be worlds apart from the economic hardships racking Ukraine. Artist Peter Oliver explains.
They overthrew the elected government. Now the people of Kiev's Independence Square have a message for those who would lead the country.
They have to gather together all these oligarchs and put their stolen money that's in foreign accounts into Ukraine. Not just their money, but sell their houses, their cars, their jewelry, and put it into the National Bank.
Two of the latest names to take over key roles in Ukraine are also among the richest in the country. Igor Kolomoisky is the third richest man in Ukraine, with a fortune estimated at a cool $2.4 billion. Sergei Taruta is thought to be worth around $2 billion. But other members of the parliament-appointed authorities in Kiev are hardly poverty-stricken.
Arseny Yatsenyuk. It's one of the more modest dwellings belonging to members of the interim government, but some of Ukraine's new leadership live far more opulent lifestyles.
Oleg Tagnyabok was supposed to live in a 100-square-meter apartment. However, after no other residents could recall ever having seen him, Ukrainian journalists discovered he was actually living in a mansion surrounded by high walls. And as the country gears up for elections, the business affairs of the potential presidential candidates have come under the microscope. Former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko is the proud owner of a series of luxury homes, including one in the exclusive village of Silver Bay, which boasts a private beach and moorings for a yacht. While Petro Poroshenko's multi-million-dollar country pile has more than a little of the White House about it. For many of those on Independence Square, too many presidential hopefuls have been too close to too much of the country's cash for far too long.
I want to see professionals, not oligarchs, surrounding the country. They've all been around the power for a long time. I want to see new faces, each a real specialist.
But despite the calls for an end to the reign of the oligarchs from protesters, it seems all of those vying for power in Kiev come straight out of Ukraine's financial elite. Peter Oliver, RT, Kiev.
Still to come in the program, the Afghan president hits out at the U.S., saying his people died in a war that wasn't theirs, slamming Washington's involvement in his country as the clock ticks towards a U.S. troop withdrawal. We'll have more of that after this.